In the earlier chapter, we touched on modules and we touched on variables and their data types. There were two variables that we touched on in the earlier chapter. They were my file and my date. In the earlier chapter, we used the dim statement to declare my file as a string. And we used the dim statement to declare my date as a date. Basically, to declare a variable means using the dim statement, which is short for dimension, and then giving the variable a name. So I like to use my, two letters in front of whatever a name I assign, my file, my date, and then declaring that variable as the type of data that variable would contain. If that variable was to contain a yes, no, or a true, false, then that variable would be declared as a Boolean. If that variable was to hold a number, it could either be a byte, a double, a decimal, an integer, a long, or a single. They are all number data types. The difference between each one is the largest and smallest number that data type will hold and whether it will hold decimal places. So for example, if I declare, say, my age as a byte, it means I can only put a number between 0 and 255, no negative values, and no decimal places. But if I declared, say, my hectares as an integer, then I would be able to put a number between negative 32,768 and positive 32,768, but again no decimal places. Each data type takes a different amount of space, and so it's all a matter of choosing the most efficient data type for your variable. You can also declare a variable as a date, or as a currency, or as a string, which is text. And lastly, if you don't declare a variable, or you can't decide what variable type is best, is variant. A variant takes the most amount of space, but a variable declared as a variant will basically hold any type of data. So anyway, let's have a look at modules and variables and data types. The first thing I want to do is open up a file called Chapter 3. Once I open the file called Chapter 3, I'd like to go to the sheet called Variables. Now I'd also then like to go to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to press Alt F11 to jump to the Visual Basic Editor. I'd then like to insert a module, so I'm going to go to Insert and Module, though I could click this button and choose Module. Immediately a Modules folder is created, and I'm placed in a module called Module 1. I'd then like to rename that module, and I'd like to rename it Mod Variables. So I click on the name property in the Properties window, and I call it Mod Variables. What I'd then like to do is actually copy a sub-procedure that I've written for you in a code file. In amongst your exercise files, you will find a Word document, which is the Excel VBA code file, and I'll just bring mine up. Once you open this file, you'll be able to click on sub-variables, and it will take you immediately to this sub-procedure. I then like to highlight this text from sub to end sub, and I'll right-click and copy. I'll then jump back to my Visual Basic Editor, and I'll right-click and paste. So the purpose of that exercise file is so that sometimes we spend too much time typing, and I know that that's important, but I want to spend more time learning and less time typing. So that's why I've allowed you to sometimes copy the code, though other times I'll get you to write the code. But this code that we've copied is a sub-procedure called variables. And as this comment implies, I'm declaring two variables. I'm declaring my first name as a string, which is text, and I'm declaring my age as a byte, which is a number between 0 and 255. I'm then setting my variables to equal something. So my first name is an input box, and I'm asking them to enter their first name. Having done that, I'm then asking them to establish their age by using an input box where they enter their age in years. Once they've entered a first name and that becomes my first name, once they've entered a age in years and that becomes my age, I can use it in two ways. I can use those variables in a message box, or I can actually store them in a worksheet. If I use them in a message box, I've created a message box here that says hi and whatever they said their first name was. Then a second message box will come up and say, so you are, and whatever age they said they were, and then the text years old. They'll then go off to the cell A1 and they'll find that the first name will be entered in A1. Then they will be offset 0 rows and 1 column, and the text age will be entered in B1. Then they'll be offset 0 rows and 1 column again, and the age will be entered in C1. So let's just try this. I might move this code down a little bit, bring up Excel, and bring up the code as well. And I'm just going to step through this code, but I want to have the spreadsheet showing as well. So if you've got two screens, arrange the two screens, the Excel and the VBA, on the two screens, or if you've got a large screen, put them side by side. What I'm going to do is press F8, and when I press F8, of course, it starts to step into this particular sub-procedure. When I rest on my first name, at the moment, it's equal to nothing, hence just double quote, and my age is equal to 0 because we haven't entered a first name or an age yet. So variables always have a value from the beginning of the sub-procedure to the end of the sub-procedure, but that value may change as the sub-procedure runs. When I press F8 and then F8 again, I get the message box, or the input box, sorry, the input box that says enter your first name. So I'll enter Cathi. And when I click OK, I'm taken back to my code. When I rest on my first name and any instance of it, I can see my first name is now Cathi, but my age is still 0. I'll then press F8 again, and now the input box asking me to enter my age in years pops up. So I'll type 21. And when I click OK, I'm taken back to my code. If I rest on any instance of the variable my age, I can see it's no longer 0, but it is in fact 21. Now a message box, when I press F8, will come up and say, hi Cathi, and I'll click OK. If I press F8 again, another message box comes up, so you are 21 years old, and I click OK again. So those were my two message boxes combining text and double quotes, an ampersand, and whatever the variable was that was inputted earlier. Now when I press F8, and let me just cause a situation, I'll click here, then I'll bring it back to the front. So now when I press F8, I should go to A1. So it takes me to A1. In the active cell, it'll put my first name, so it'll put Cathi in A1. It'll then offset itself 1 column and 0 rows and go to B1, and it'll put the text in double quotes, age colon, into that cell. I'll then press F8 again, and it'll move again across 1 column and 0 rows, and when I press F8 again, it'll enter the age 21. And when I press F8 again, that will end the sub-procedure. So here we declared two variables. Here we use an input box to establish a value for each of those variables, and then we use those variables either in a message or we stored those variables in the spreadsheet. I'm just going to save this file. I'll press F12, and I'm going to save the file as Chapter 3 done. Now you may come across an application input box, which is slightly different from an input box. What we might do is call this variables 1, and in our exercise file we'll go and get another sub-variables. You can't have two sub-procedures with the same name, hence why I call the other one variables 1. I'll then copy this sub-procedure, go back to my Visual Basic Editor, and I'll paste this one below my first one. I'll then name this variables 2. So they're very, very similar. Let me just increase your viewing. They're very similar in that we, in both cases, declare two variables, my first name and my age. Where the difference lies, instead of an input box, which is quite simple in the first variables sub-procedure, we've used an application input box in the second sub-procedure. An application input box insists that you have a prompt and that you have a type. And there's even more options, but those are the main two. Now let me show you why you'd use an application input box. For example, if I go to this first sub-procedure and I run this first sub-procedure, so I'll press F5 to run it. It pops up and says, what is your first name? So I'll go Cathi, and OK or enter, and then it says, what is your age? Now some people, and you have to account for certain people, will type 21. They won't type it as a number because your prompt doesn't actually tell them to type it as a number. So if I type 21 or I type 1 and go OK, I actually end up with this. And that is a type mismatch. Never do we want our users to encounter this particular window, because if they encounter this particular window, it means that they can go debug and they'll go into your code. And through best intentions, they'll try to fix the problem, which might end up being more of a problem. If I was to go debug, the problem with the age is that it won't accept 21 as text. It wants 21, it won't accept 21 as text. It has to be 21 as a number. And in fact, deeper than that, it won't affect an age that's not a byte. That's not a number between 0 and 255. It will not accept text. Otherwise, that would have been declared as a string or a variant. But it's not handled very well in the fact that they end up with this window appearing. So to avoid this type mismatch causing a problem, we use an application input box. So I'm just going to click End. Now I'm going to go to this sub-procedure and press F5 and run this one. When I run this one and I input, and notice it looks a little different, I'll input my name Cathi and enter, and then your age in years. If I go 21 and enter, instead of debug end, I get this. The number is not valid. That's a much better response to the fact that they've typed their age incorrectly. So when I read that, I think, oh, they want a number. So I'll go OK, and I'll type 21 and OK. And then that is a much better response. So they are out there, statements using application input box, and you need to be aware of them too. And that's in your notes, and we will be coming back to the application input box on several occasions. Basically, a type 2 is text, a type 1 is a number, and there are other ones listed as well in your notes.